You've already heard about climate change, right? But do you understand the difference between weather and climate? Well, weather is about a specific moment. For example, today it is raining. It's a rainy weather. But if we talk about climate, we mean a weather pattern during a longer period of time, usually decades. For example, John lives at a place where it rains a lot during the month of January. In this particular case, the climate in January is rainy. Now, when we talk about climate change, we are actually talking about how this weather pattern is changing drastically. When John was a little boy, it used to rain all throughout January, but now, years later, the rainy season starts only in the middle of February. This climate change is already considerably affecting our lives. Talking about a concrete example, extreme weather events such as storms are more frequent or stronger. In addition, the sea level is rising. Furthermore, temperatures are increasing, which can put harvests at risk, degrade pastures, and affect livelihoods, amongst other impacts. Where John lives, water storage reservoirs are drying up due to the delay of rains. This can result in water shortage. Our current way of living completely depends on the climate, which we cannot rely on anymore. So, in order to preserve our welfare, we need to act now. But what can we do? One way is to reduce climate change via mitigation. John could think twice if he needs to use his car, or if he could take his bike instead. We could also replace high-emitting factories with cleaner alternatives. Mitigation is important, that's why John has to change certain habits. However, climate change is happening, and John has to learn how to adapt to those upcoming changes. Adaptation means adjusting to the actual or future adverse effects of climate change. If we act appropriately in order to prevent or minimize the damage that climate change can cause, we can even take advantage of opportunities that may arise. The adaptation to climate change can happen in different ways, from engineering techniques to the development and implementation of policies, such as a national adaptation plan, or through ecosystem-based adaptation, called EBA. The purpose of ecosystem-based adaptation is to help people adapt to the impacts of climate change by making sustainable use of biodiversity and the so-called ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are services that nature provides: air to breathe, water to drink, fruits, pollination, and we need them in order to survive. Another example, vegetation growing on mountain slopes helps to prevent landslides, a classical ecosystem service. However, when the ecosystem is negatively affected by human activities, ecosystem services cannot be provided properly, which might make the population more vulnerable to climate change. For example, a city that is located next to a mountain slope that has been deforested is at higher risk of being affected by a landslide induced by heavy rainfall. When we think of possibilities to adapt to this impact, we can either build a protective wall against those landslides as a traditional engineering type of response, or we could use an ecosystem-based approach, such as planting native trees at the slope. The tree's roots create a natural barrier, which helps preventing landslides. Ecosystem-based approaches are nature conservation measures, restoration of ecosystems, and the sustainable use of biodiversity. These measures are the basis for the so-called green infrastructure, and they contribute to both human and environmental well-being. That is why ecosystem-based adaptation is interesting in many cases. However, in order to implement ecosystem-based adaptation measures in a systematic manner, we have to ensure a few steps. The first step is to assess the circumstances and the situation we want to act upon. In which conditions are today the soil, water, and our general way of living? How can these conditions possibly be affected by climate change? This assessment, the so-called climate lens, can help in order to estimate the impacts of, for example, higher temperatures and scarcity of rain in the nearer future. It is relevant to understand what might happen with our territory, our goods, and the ecosystems we rely on. By these means, we can assess if it is necessary or not to take a closer look on possible climate impacts when planning for the longer future. If it is relevant to integrate climate change in our planning, the next step is to do a climate risk assessment. In other words, to discover how people, goods, and areas are exposed and sensitive to climate change and which capacity they have to adapt to different potential climate change impacts. For example, climate change can lead to scarcity of rain and thus to the drying out of rivers in AbE's range. However, she needs the water coming from rivers to irrigate arable land and finally to produce food. If the river runs dry, the quality and quantity of harvests are negatively affected and lead to a loss of income. With that in mind, it is easy to perceive the third step: identify options for adaptation. Thinking in EBA logic, how could you conserve, restore, or manage better ecosystems to reduce people's risk facing changing climate scenarios? The choice of the suitable measure can be done by prioritization. To do that, let us analyze everything. How much will different approaches to adaptation cost? Which are the most sustainable ones on the long term, and which ones will have the best results? After choosing the best option, we get to the fifth step: implementation. After discussing different approaches in our example, AbE might therefore decide that the best way to adapt is to recover the native forests on the riversides. That should help improve the water balance while helping to avoid soil erosion and contributing to the pollination of AbE's crops. Monitoring and evaluation closes the cycle to consider ecosystem-based adaptation into planning. It is important to evaluate if the options implemented generate the expected results. This guarantees the long-term success of the adaptation measure and helps us to learn and improve. The development and implementation of ecosystem-based adaptation measures always works best as a participatory process and involves all actors that depend on the territory in question. It is a matter of good public management and participation of local communities. This requires transparency of information and knowledge management in order to guarantee that everybody can participate and contribute to decision-making. To invest in a healthy ecosystem today is better than trying to fix negative impacts of climate change later. Moreover, it can be cheaper. You are not alone. There are different successful initiatives already in place to discuss ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change. Let's adapt ourselves to climate change with green solutions.